December 17th, 1944. The hour was somewhere around 5:30 in the morning, though in the pre-dawn darkness of the Belgian Ardennes, time felt suspended, frozen like the ground beneath the treads of the massive Tiger tanks. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper stood in the turret of his command tank, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter cold. The Maybach engine had coughed, sputtered, and then fallen silent. Around him, the most powerful armored formation Germany had assembled for this desperate winter offensive sat motionless in the darkness, not from enemy fire, not from mechanical failure, from something far more devastating: empty fuel tanks. Peiper climbed down from his tank, his boots crunching on frozen Belgian soil. In every direction, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, beat and nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers sat paralyzed. The fuel gauges all told the same story. Empty, reserve tanks empty. They had advanced barely 20 miles from their starting point, and already the offensive was grinding to a halt, not because of American resistance, but because of something as mundane, as unglamorous as gasoline. Then, through the morning mist, Peiper saw it. The town of Hansfeld lay just ahead, recently abandoned by fleeing American forces. Fires still burned in oil drums, coffee sat steaming in metal cups, and there, lined up like a gift from the gods of war themselves, stood rows upon rows of jerry cans, the distinctive olive-drab American fuel containers, thousands of them, stacked 3 meters high, extending for 200 meters. One of Peiper's officers pried open a can and sniffed. High-octane gasoline, American aviation fuel, far better quality than anything German vehicles typically ran on. As his men began the frantic work of refueling, Peiper walked among the stockpile. He was counting. The mathematics were staggering: 50,000 gallons, enough to fuel his entire battle group for the push to the Meuse River, enough, potentially, to change the course of this offensive. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in this single forward depot than most German divisions had received in the past 6 months. But as Peiper stood among this bounty, watching American fuel pour into German tanks, something shifted in his mind. A crushing realization began to settle over him like the morning fog. If the Americans could afford to abandon such quantities of fuel, if they could leave behind what Germany would guard with entire divisions, then perhaps this war was already decided. Perhaps Germany hadn't just miscalculated the odds. Perhaps Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the enemy they were fighting. This is the story of that moment, the moment when one of Germany's finest military minds discovered that his country wasn't fighting a war. It was participating in its own execution. Joachim Peiper was no ordinary German officer. At 29 years old, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS. He wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords around his neck, decorations earned through brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. He was handsome, charismatic, ruthless. His men trusted him even under impossible conditions. They had followed him through the frozen hell of the Russian winter, through countless desperate battles where fuel and ammunition were measured out by the leader and the bullet. For this operation, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, Peiper had been chosen to lead Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead unit of the entire Ardennes offensive. His battle group consisted of nearly 5,000 men and 600 vehicles, including 35 Panther tanks, 45 Panzer Mark IVs, and 45 of the fearsome Tiger II tanks. These Tigers, the heaviest and most powerful tanks in the German arsenal, could destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire was impossible. On paper, Kampfgruppe Peiper was unstoppable. But there was a problem, a fatal flaw built into the plan from the very beginning. Those Tiger II tanks, magnificent machines of destruction, consumed fuel at a horrifying rate. 2.5 gallons per mile in combat conditions. The Ardennes terrain, with its steep hills, narrow roads, and winter mud, made consumption even worse. And the mission called for Peiper's battle group to advance 72 miles through enemy territory, cross the Meuse River, and drive all the way to the port of Antwerp. The fuel allocation for this mission? 31,000 gallons. enough for about 50 miles of combat operations. To reach Antwerp, Peiper would need to travel at least 70 miles. The mathematics of failure were encoded in the plan from the very start. German High Command knew this. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, he had been brutally honest at the final briefing 2 days before the offensive. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies." If the entire operation, Germany's last roll of the dice in the West, depended on capturing fuel from the enemy. This wasn't tactical planning. This was desperation wearing a uniform. To understand just how desperate Germany's fuel situation had become by December 1944, you have to step back 6 months. In May of that year, Allied bombers had begun a systematic campaign against Germany's synthetic fuel production facilities. Germany, unlike the United States or the Soviet Union, had virtually no natural oil reserves. Instead, they had developed a sophisticated system of synthetic fuel plants that used coal liquefaction processes to manufacture gasoline. These plants were technological marvels, requiring enormous amounts of coal, complex chemical processes, and months of uninterrupted operation to produce meaningful quantities of fuel. The Leuna Works, Germany's largest synthetic fuel plant, had produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April 1944. By September, after repeated Allied bombing raids, production had collapsed to 5,000 tons. Plant after plant was destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The Pulitz, Bleckhammer, and Brooks hydrogenation plants were operating at less than 10% capacity. Germany's fuel production infrastructure was systematically being destroyed. The numbers told a story of inevitable defeat. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including all synthetic production and the captured Romanian oil fields, managed 33 million barrels. Germany was producing less than 2% of what America produced. The Third Reich was attempting to wage mechanized warfare with horse-drawn logistics, and it wasn't just the quantity, it was the quality. American refineries had perfected catalytic cracking processes that produced high-octane fuels efficiently. American 100-octane aviation gasoline gave Allied aircraft performance advantages German pilots could only dream of. German synthetic fuel was lower octane, requiring more refining, more processing, more resources that Germany no longer had. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft for lack of aviation fuel. Pilot training had been cut from 250 flight hours to just 60 hours. The German Navy's surface fleet had effectively ceased operations. Submarines were fitted with snorkels to conserve diesel by running on batteries. On the home front, German civilians hadn't seen private automobile traffic since 1942. Farmers were returning to horse-drawn plows. The Gestapo investigated black market theft of individual liters of gasoline. Meanwhile, the United States was producing 67% of the world's oil. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe. American refineries were operating at such capacity that they were experimenting with new petroleum byproducts simply because they had excess crude oil to process. This was the context in which Hitler ordered the Ardennes offensive. This was the reality that informed Sepp Dietrich's brutal assessment that Peiper would need to capture American fuel to complete his mission. The offensive began on December 16th at 5:30 in the morning with a massive artillery barrage. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire across an 80-mile front, the sound rolling like thunder through the frozen Ardennes forest. But Kampfgruppe Peiper didn't move. They sat immobile on a congested road near the town of Losheim, waiting. The German infantry, who were supposed to punch a hole through American lines for the tanks to exploit, were delayed. Road conditions were terrible. A key bridge had been destroyed in an earlier retreat, and German engineers were slow to repair it. When Peiper finally received word to advance, it was already late in the afternoon of the first day, hours behind schedule. Then came more delays. At the village of Lanzerath, just 18 American soldiers from an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon held up Peiper's entire battle group for nearly 10 hours, 18 men against 5,000. They fought from foxholes and woodland positions, making the Germans believe they faced a much larger force. It was a masterclass in small unit defensive tactics, and it cost Peiper precious time and, more importantly, precious fuel. His vehicles sat idling on narrow roads, burning gasoline while they waited. Tiger tanks that consumed 2.5 gallons per mile were burning fuel, just sitting still. By the time Kampfgruppe Peiper broke through at dawn on December 17th and reached Hansfeld, they had covered just 20 miles and consumed 40% of their fuel allocation. At this rate, they would run dry before reaching the halfway point to their objective. The road conditions were far worse than German maps had indicated. What appeared as highways on paper were actually narrow country lanes, many unpaved. The massive Tiger tanks, designed for the open steppes of Russia, struggled through the tight winding roads of the Ardennes. Traffic jams developed immediately as vehicles designed for rapid advances found themselves crawling through a landscape that seemed designed to stop them. And then, finally, there was Hansfeld, a small Belgian town that housed a rest center for the American 99th Infantry Division. Confused American troops, many of them just waking up, were quickly overrun. Peiper's men captured several dozen prisoners, many of whom were subsequently murdered. They destroyed numerous American armored units and vehicles, and they found the fuel depot. 50,000 gallons of American fuel. To Peiper and his men, this seemed like a miracle. It was more than they had started the offensive with. It was enough to get them to the Meuse River. It was enough to give the operation real hope again. As his men worked frantically to transfer the fuel into German vehicles, you can imagine the relief, the elation even, that must have swept through the exhausted soldiers of Kampfgruppe Peiper. But the fuel itself told a story that Peiper was intelligent enough to read. This wasn't a major supply depot. This was a forward fuel station, with the U.S. Army classified as a Class 3B depot, a temporary refueling point for frontline units. Yet what Peiper found here exceeded the monthly fuel allocation for an entire German panzer division. What Germany would consider a strategic reserve that required massive security, the Americans had simply left behind in their hasty retreat, not even attempting to destroy it. The fuel was high-octane aviation gasoline mixed with motor fuel, 80 octane or higher. German vehicles were designed for 74-octane fuel. The American gasoline was actually too good, causing engine problems in several German vehicles. The Americans had fuel so abundant that they could afford to use high-grade aviation fuel in their trucks and supply vehicles. Germany was scraping together whatever synthetic fuel they could produce, often of questionable quality, and rationing it down to the last liter. One of Peiper's officers found shipping manifests in the depot office. He could read English, having worked in his father's import business before the war. The papers told an extraordinary story. This fuel had been shipped from Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the English Channel to Normandy, and then trucked 400 miles to this small Belgian town. The journey of over 6,000 miles had taken less than 6 weeks. Think about that for a moment. Fuel had traveled from oil fields in Texas, across an ocean, across a continent, through an active war zone, to end up in a temporary depot in a small Belgian town. And the Americans had enough of it that they could afford to abandon it rather than spend precious minutes destroying it. The logistical sophistication, the industrial capacity, the sheer abundance required to make such a system work was beyond anything German planners had imagined. Another German soldier found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated just 2 days earlier. The headline celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper would use in the entire offensive. The soldier showed the newspaper to Peiper. According to later accounts, Peiper read it twice, then crumpled it up without saying a word. But witnesses said his face went pale. The implications were impossible to miss. The American logistics system that Peiper had just glimpsed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was a machine of such scale and sophistication that it would define the future of warfare. At the heart of it was the Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system that had been operating since late August 1944. Nearly 6,000 trucks operating in round-the-clock convoys, delivering 12,500 tons of supplies daily to frontline units. The trucks themselves were standardized GMC 2.5-ton vehicles produced by the hundreds of thousands in American factories. They were rugged, reliable, and most importantly, they were everywhere. The Red Ball Express was staffed primarily by African American soldiers, roughly 75% of the drivers and cargo handlers. These men drove through day and night, through terrible weather, through contested territory, keeping the American advance supplied with everything it needed. By the time the Battle of the Bulge began, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies. The operation itself consumed more fuel daily than Army Group B, the German formation facing them, received in a month. But the Red Ball Express was just one part of the system. The Americans had also constructed Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, which laid underwater pipes across the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons daily from Britain to France. Additional pipeline networks extended inland. The Cherbourg-Paris line delivered 800,000 gallons daily. Other lines moved 650,000 gallons daily. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons of fuel daily, while receiving 8.2 million gallons. They were actually building reserves during active offensive operations. Let that sink in. The Americans were using more fuel than they received, consuming enormous quantities in combat operations, and they were still accumulating reserves. They had so much fuel that storage was becoming a problem. They had so much fuel that when German forces threatened depots, American commanders didn't hesitate to burn millions of gallons rather than risk capture. The scale of American production was simply incomprehensible to German planners. While Germany struggled to produce synthetic fuel from coal using complex chemical processes, America was pulling oil from the ground in quantities that defied imagination. Texas oil fields alone produced more petroleum than all the territories controlled by the Axis powers combined. American production in 1944 was 50 times larger than German production, and it wasn't just raw quantity. The Americans had standardized everything. Sherman tanks consumed 0.8 gallons per mile compared to the Tiger's 2.5 gallons. American trucks achieved 8 miles per gallon when fully loaded. Parts were interchangeable, maintenance was simplified, logistics were streamlined. German forces operated a bewildering array of captured and manufactured vehicles with different fuel requirements. French tanks needed different oil than German Panthers. Soviet trucks required different parts than German Opels. Each complication multiplied logistical difficulties exponentially. The American soldier at the front received 67 pounds of supplies daily. The German soldier received 3 pounds. American forces could afford to be wasteful because they had such abundance. German forces had to measure everything by the liter and the kilogram because they had so little. As Kampfgruppe Peiper pushed westward from Hansfeld, powered by their captured American fuel, the realization of what they faced began to spread through the German ranks. They weren't just fighting better-equipped Americans, they were fighting an industrial system that operated on a scale that made German scarcity irrelevant. One soldier later wrote to his wife, "The Americans destroy more fuel daily than we receive monthly. They drive tanks like we march. This war is lost." At Büllingen, Peiper captured another fuel depot and more supplies, but by now the pattern was becoming clear. Every American position they overran contained more fuel and supplies than German units saw in months. The Americans didn't guard their fuel depots with large forces because they had so many depots, so much fuel, that the loss of any single location was tactically insignificant. German prisoners captured during the offensive were consistently more shocked by American waste than by American firepower. Seeing American soldiers discard half-eaten rations, use gasoline for heating their positions, fire artillery for ranging exercises, this casual abundance shattered German morale more effectively than any weapon. One captured German officer told his interrogators, We knew your production numbers abstractly. But seeing soldiers waste more than we possessed made them real. Every German who saw your casual abundance knew the war was hopeless. But the most devastating realization was still to come. As Peiper's forces advanced toward Stavelot on December 18th, they received intelligence reports about a massive American fuel depot near the town. 2 million gallons. If they could capture it, they could supply not just Kampfgruppe Peiper, but multiple German divisions. It would give the offensive real strategic reach. It would change everything. Peiper pushed his forces hard, knowing that speed was essential. His lead elements approached Stavelot in the early morning hours. The town's bridge was critical. Beyond it lay the fuel depot. Beyond that lay the road to the Meuse River and potentially victory, or at least a negotiated peace, or at least not total defeat. But as his advance guard neared the depot, they saw smoke, black smoke, rising thousands of feet into the winter sky. The Americans and Belgian volunteers were destroying the fuel. Rather than allow it to fall into German hands, they were burning it. Not just some of it, all of it, 2 million gallons going up in flames. The destruction of the Stavelot fuel depot became legendary in the chronicles of the Battle of the Bulge, though the exact details remain somewhat disputed. What is certain is that American engineers and Belgian volunteers set fire to massive quantities of American fuel to prevent its capture. Some sources say 124,000 gallons were used to create a flaming roadblock. Other sources indicate much larger quantities were destroyed. What matters is what the act represented. Major Paul Solis, commanding American forces in the area, made the decision. His men poured gasoline across the road in a deep cut where German tanks couldn't maneuver around it. They set it ablaze. The result was a perfect tank barrier, a wall of flames that no vehicle could cross. Peiper's lead tanks arrived to find an inferno stretching for miles. The fire would burn for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to have powered Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back. One of Peiper's officers described the scene. The Obersturmbannführer stood on his tank turret watching the flames. He said nothing for perhaps 5 minutes. Then he climbed down and told me, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. What are we doing here?" This was the moment. This was when the fundamental imbalance of the war became impossible to deny. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were destroying fuel dumps rather than risk capture. At Trois Ponts, 1.1 million gallons burned. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed. In total, Americans deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel during the first week of the offensive. This was more fuel than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. The ability to casually destroy millions of gallons was rooted in a supply system beyond German comprehension. It revealed a fundamental truth about industrial warfare that would define all conflicts that followed. In modern war, production capacity matters more than tactical brilliance. Logistics determines outcomes more surely than courage. Abundance defeats dedication. Peiper's force continued advancing, but the fuel crisis was now critical. They reached Cheneux, where American fighter bombers destroyed 2 tanks and 5 half-tracks, blocking the narrow road. At Trois Ponts, they found the bridge blown up minutes before their arrival. At Stoumont, they engaged in fierce combat with American forces, burning precious fuel in tank battles that achieved nothing strategic. By December 19th, tanks were being abandoned with empty fuel tanks rather than from battle damage. Peiper consolidated his remaining fuel, perhaps 8,000 gallons left, enough for one more engagement or enough to retreat, but not both. Meanwhile, Allied planners were requesting 245 million gallons for January operations. The request was approved without discussion. The contrast was so stark it bordered on the absurd. By December 21st, Peiper was surrounded at L'Église, his tanks immobile. American forces encircling him, the 30th Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne, and elements of the 3rd Armored Division had a combined fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons for that single day. Peiper had perhaps 1,000 gallons left for his entire battle group. An American captain joked in his unit diary, We use more fuel heating coffee than they have for tanks. The German forces surrounding Peiper were also struggling with fuel shortages. Attempts to break through to relieve him failed not because of American resistance, but because German tanks ran out of fuel halfway to their objective. The entire German offensive across the Ardennes was grinding to a halt as vehicle after vehicle emptied their tanks and fell silent. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, Peiper made the decision to abandon his vehicles and escape on foot. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that began the offensive, 39 remained operational but immobilized by lack of fuel. These were destroyed with their remaining ammunition. Vehicles worth millions of Reichsmarks, destroyed by empty fuel tanks. Of the 5,000 men who began with Kampfgruppe Peiper, approximately 770 returned to German lines on foot, having advanced 60 miles into American territory before fuel exhaustion ended their mission. One of Peiper's men described the final hours. We drained the last fuel from all vehicles. Maybe 200 gallons total. The Obersturmbannführer personally destroyed his command tank. Millions of Reichsmarks of equipment destroyed by empty fuel tanks. They slipped through American lines under cover of darkness, leaving behind their tanks, their vehicles, their heavy weapons, everything that had made them the most powerful armored formation in the German army. News of Peiper's failure spread rapidly through German command. Field Marshal Walter Model, receiving reports on captured American supplies and destroyed American fuel dumps, reportedly said, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler, informed of the fuel situation on December 28th, refused to accept reality. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments, recorded Hitler's response. Hitler insisted the numbers were propaganda. When shown photographs of the burning Stavelot depot, he claimed they were Hollywood special effects. But lower ranks understood the truth. Letters home, despite censorship, carried the message, "Americans destroy more fuel daily than we receive monthly. They drive tanks like we march. This war is lost." The fuel crisis during the Battle of the Bulge was symptomatic of a larger truth that had defined the war since 1942. By 1944, America was producing 50% of the world's manufacturing output. A new aircraft rolled off American production lines every 5 minutes. A ship was completed daily, a tank every 7 minutes. The scale of industrial production was so vast that it had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. Petroleum production statistics told the story most clearly. The United States produced 1.8 billion barrels in 1944. The Soviet Union produced 110 million barrels. Germany, including all synthetic production, managed 33 million barrels. Japan produced 2.6 million barrels. The Axis powers combined produced less than 2% of American petroleum. Every major German offensive after 1942 had been constrained by fuel shortages. Every American offensive was supported by abundance German planners couldn't even imagine. The story of Peiper's discovery at Hansfeld resonates because it represents the moment when industrial warfare reached its logical conclusion. The romantic notion of warfare, where tactics, training, and warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantages, died in the Ardennes among empty fuel tanks. Wars between industrial powers would be won by factories and refineries, not by brilliant generals. The German soldier of 1944 was arguably better trained and more experienced than his American counterpart. It didn't matter. The Americans were backed by an industrial machine that could waste more than Germany could produce. This truth was encoded in every jerry can at Hansfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelot, every pipeline across France. Modern warfare had become a contest of logistics and production. The side that could produce more, deliver more, and sustain more would win, regardless of tactical brilliance or individual courage. Peiper and his men were some of the finest soldiers Germany had ever produced, but they were fighting against mathematics that couldn't be overcome by bravery or tactical skill. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 Americans and perhaps 100,000 Germans. It destroyed Germany's last strategic reserves, but its lasting impact was spreading knowledge through the German ranks that America possessed incomprehensible abundance. That knowledge, more than any tactical defeat, destroyed German morale and made further resistance seem pointless. The war didn't end immediately, but after the Bulge, everyone knew the outcome was inevitable. Joachim Peiper survived the war, was imprisoned until 1956 for war crimes committed during the offensive, including the Malmedy massacre, where his forces murdered 84 American prisoners. After his release, he worked for Porsche and Volkswagen before retiring to France. On July 14, 1976, Bastille Day, unknown assailants attacked his home and set it on fire. Peiper died in the flames. But before his death, in a 1967 interview with historian Henry Lehman, he offered a final reflection on that December morning at Hansfeld. "Finding that depot was the worst thing," Peiper said. "If we'd run out of fuel earlier, we might have retreated with dignity. Instead, we discovered the Americans had oceans while we had drops. We discovered impossibility." The Tiger tank from Kampfgruppe Peiper still sits in the museum at La Glaise, positioned exactly where it ran out of fuel on December 23, 1944. Its fuel gauge reads empty. Visitors often ask why such powerful tanks were abandoned in working condition. The answer is simple, and it tells you everything about how this war was won and lost. No fuel. The 50,000 gallons captured at Hansfeld seemed like a miracle to German forces who measured fuel by the liter. To the Americans, it was less than a single armored division consumed in 2 days. It was less than the Red Ball Express burned in 3 hours of operations. It was a rounding error in Allied daily consumption. And that difference, that impossible chasm between German scarcity and American abundance, decided the outcome of not just the Battle of the Bulge, but the entire war. Modern militaries study the Battle of the Bulge for many reasons. They study Peiper's tactics, the weather's impact, the role of intelligence, the importance of small unit actions. But perhaps the most important lesson is the one Peiper himself learned that frozen December morning among piles of abandoned American fuel cans. In industrial warfare, logistics supersedes tactics, production overwhelms courage, abundance defeats dedication, and no amount of training, experience, or tactical brilliance can overcome a fundamental imbalance in industrial capacity. The lesson extends far beyond World War II. It shapes how nations think about military preparedness today, how they calculate readiness, how they measure strength. Because Peiper's discovery wasn't just about fuel, it was about the nature of modern war itself. And the truth he discovered that morning remains relevant in every conflict that has followed. If you found this story fascinating, if you're interested in more deep dives into moments that defined World War II, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. History isn't just about battles and dates. It's about moments like this when individual soldiers glimpsed larger truths about the conflicts they were fighting, when tactical realities revealed strategic impossibilities, when the mathematics of war became undeniable. Thanks for watching. Until next time, remember that history's greatest lessons often come from its smallest details. And sometimes, the most important discoveries aren't made in victories, but in the moments when defeat becomes inevitable and undeniable.